Hello students, today we are going to study class 8 science chapter 12, that is friction. In this chapter we will discuss about friction. So what is friction, students? So friction is an opposing force which opposes the motion. To make the concept of friction more clear, first of all we will discuss few day-to-day examples of friction. So as we have seen, a ball rolling along the ground gradually slows down and finally comes to rest. You know what is the reason behind this? Yes, it is due to the force of friction. It is the force of friction between the surface of the ball and the surface of the ground. And the surface of the ground opposes the motion of the ball, and finally the ball comes to rest. That means when we kick a ball, it comes to rest after sometimes due to force of friction. In the same way, when you stop pedaling a bicycle, it gradually slows down and finally comes to rest. It is the force of friction between the surface of the wheels of the bicycle and surface of the ground that opposes the motion of the bicycle and brings the bicycle to rest. That means the cycle comes to rest. So how can we define friction? The force acting along the two surfaces in contact which opposes the motion of one object over the other is called force of friction. That means friction opposes the. So what are the causes of friction? Friction is caused due to the roughness of surfaces in contact. Every solid object has a rough surface. The degree of roughness varies from surface to surface. Some surfaces are more rough while some are smooth. So we cannot see the smoothness or roughness of the surface with a naked eye. So in each object there are very small tiny hills and valleys. So when an object is pulled over another, these tiny hills and valleys present on both the surfaces in contact get entangled with each other. That means the interlocking of the two surfaces opposes the motion of one object over another and gives rise to frictional force. So it is very clear from the diagram that object B is interlocked with surface A. The tiny hills and valleys, they have interlocked with each other. That means friction is due to the roughness of these surfaces in contact. So what are the different types of friction? There are three types of friction: static friction, limiting friction and kinetic friction. So first of all we are going to start with static friction. So what is static friction? It is the opposing force that comes into play when one object tends to move over the surface of another. The opposing force that comes into play when one object tends to move over the surface of another, but the actual motion has not started, is called static friction. That means it is the position of rest. It prevents the motion and does not allow two objects to slide upon one another. So it always prevents motion. And second is limiting friction. So what is limiting friction? Limiting friction is the maximum opposing force that comes into play when one object is just at the verge of moving over the surface of another object. Suppose if we move a heavy box from one place to another, the force required to overcome friction at the instant the box starts moving from rest is a measure of limiting friction. The static friction at this stage is maximum. At this time the static friction is maximum, and this maximum value of static friction is called the limiting friction, and that maximum value of static friction is known as limiting friction. So what is kinetic friction? So kinetic friction is the opposing force that comes into play when one object is actually moving over the surface of another object. There are two kinds of kinetic friction. One is sliding friction and another is rolling friction. So first of all, let's discuss one example of kinetic friction. When we increase the applied force slightly beyond the limiting friction, we see that the box begins to slide slowly. This does not mean that friction has disappeared. It only means that the applied force is now greater than the force of limiting friction. That means the force that was applied is more than the limiting friction. The force of friction at this stage is known as kinetic friction, and this stage the friction is known as kinetic friction. So kinetic friction is of two types. First is sliding friction and another is rolling friction. So what is sliding friction? The opposing force that comes into play when one object is actually sliding over the surface of another object. When one object is sliding on the another object, this type of opposing force is known as sliding friction. What is rolling friction? The opposing force that comes into play when one object is actually rolling over the surface of another object. Can you see the wheels are there? So whenever possible, sliding friction is replaced by rolling friction. This is achieved by using wheels, ball bearings, etc. These days, suitcases and bags are also provided with tiny wheels. Even a child can pull such type of suitcases. These wheels have very small rolling friction. That is the reason it is convenient to pull suitcases fitted with rollers. Now, what are the factors which affect friction? So the force of friction depends upon two factors. The number one is nature of these surfaces in contact with each other. That means rough surfaces, more friction, smooth surfaces, less friction. That means when the surface is rough, there will be more friction, and if the surface is smooth, there will be less friction. And second factor is the weight of the object. More weight, more friction, less weight, less friction. That means if the object is having more weight, there will be more friction, and if it is having less weight, then it will have less friction. So now we are going to discuss about fluid friction. What is that? Friction due to liquids and gases, which is also known as drag. What is the definition of drag? The frictional force exerted by fluids is called drag. So not only solid surfaces exert friction on solid objects moving over them, even liquid and gases exert friction on the solid objects moving over them. This is known as fluid friction. However, liquids and gases exert lesser friction as compared to solid surface. In the picture, it is clear that water opposes the motion of the swimmer due to friction. So when a person swims in water, the water opposes its motion. This is because water exerts a force of friction on the swimmer in a direction opposite to his motion. The shape of the fishes and boat are streamlined. So first of all, what is streamlined shape? The special shape of a body or an object around which a fluid offering minimum friction is called streamlined shape. The special shape of a body or an object around which a fluid can flow offering minimum friction is called streamlined shape. So in nature we can see the bodies of fishes are streamlined. Why they are streamlined? so that they experience least amount of friction in water. And bodies of ships and bodies of boats are made streamlined, so they also experience less friction while moving through water. Friction due to air. Air exerts the force of friction on all the objects which move through it and opposes their motion. But the friction of air is so small that we are not able to experience its effect easily. So we have seen in nature the bodies of birds are streamlined. So again the reason is so they can experience least amount of friction. In the same way, the bodies of aeroplanes and bullet trains are made streamlined. Again the reason is same, children, so that they experience least friction while moving through the air. So now we are going to discuss one very important topic, that is friction is a necessary evil. Why friction is called a necessary evil? As friction plays an important role in our daily life. In some cases, friction is very useful to us and we cannot do anything without it. But at the same time, it is an evil in some cases because it results in the loss of energy and wear and tear of the surfaces. So it is also known as necessary evil. So what are the advantages of friction, or how friction is very important or necessary? So friction plays a very important role in our daily life. So first of all, it helps us to walk. The friction between our feet and the ground help us to walk on the ground without falling. Second is movement of vehicles. You have seen grooves in tires. Grooves are made in tires to increase the friction. The friction between the tires and the ground helps move on the ground without slipping. In tires, friction is increased by making grooves in them. Due to greater friction, the tires provide a better grip on the ground. So, grooves are made to increase friction. Spike shoes for better grip. Spikes are provided in the shoes of players and athletes to increase friction. To have better grip on the ground. Another is writing work. We are able to write because there is a friction between the tip of the pen and the paper. Without friction, writing with a pen or pencil is not possible. Another advantage of friction is application of brakes. The brakes of car or any moving vehicle depend upon friction. When we apply brakes, the car stops due to the force of friction between the brake lining and the drum of the wheel. Another advantage is lightning of a matchstick. So when we strike a matchstick against the rough surface of matchbox, it catches fire. Here, the force of friction raises the temperature of matchstick head so that it catch fire to produce flame. And last advantage is screws and nails. It is the force of friction which holds screws and nails in the wood. So, what are the ways of increasing friction, or why do we increase friction? So, what are the advantages of increasing friction? So, first of all, for how can we increase friction? So, we can increase friction by making the surfaces rough. Friction can be increased by increasing the roughness of the surfaces in contact. For example, you have seen the surfaces of the matchstick and the sides of the match boxes are made rough. Have you seen? The sides of the match boxes are rough. This is done to increase the friction to produce more heat, because of which matchstick lights up easily. Another is by making grooves. We can increase the friction in case of tires of bicycle, cars, buses, etc. by making grooves. Due to greater friction, the tires get a better grip on the ground, which prevents skidding of the vehicles. So now we are going to discuss how friction is an evil, or what are the disadvantages of friction. So first of all, friction damage to the machines. Friction causes damage in the machine. So how it damages the machines? So we have seen that when we rub our palms against each other, so generally we rub our palm, so it generates some amount of heat due to friction. So heat is produced between the palms. So in the same way, when the moving parts of a machine are rubbed together, a lot of heat is produced due to the friction between them. And this heat can damage the machine gradually. That means rubbing of the machine parts causes damage to the machine. Another is wear and tear. Friction causes wear and tear of the parts of the machine in contact. The parts which are in contact, there is a wear and tear. Thus, the lifetime of the machine is reduced. You have noticed that the soles of the shoes and the tires of the vehicle wear out with gradual use. Therefore, the worn out pieces has to be replaced from time to time. Another is loss of energy. How friction causes loss of energy? Friction always opposes the motion between any two objects in contact. Therefore, extra energy is spent in overcoming friction. Thus, friction involves an expense of energy. For example, as much as 10% of petrol burnt in a car is used to overcome the friction in the engine. Thus, it increases the use of fuels. And the last disadvantage is it reduces the efficiency of machine. So how it reduces the efficiency of machine? So some of the force applied to run a machine is wasted in overcoming the friction between its moving parts. This reduces the efficiency of the machine. For this reason, the efficiency of any machine is always less than 100%. So what are the ways by which we can reduce friction, or why do we reduce friction? So we know that we can reduce friction, but we can't make it zero. So how can we reduce friction? So first of all, by lubricating. So first of all, we are going to discuss what are lubricants. The substances which reduce friction are known as lubricants. So we can use lubricants, for example, oil or grease, which reduces the friction. So how they work? So when a lubricant is applied between the moving parts of a machine, a thin layer is formed there and moving surface do not directly rub each other. So what happens when we apply lubricant? There is a layer formed between the moving parts of the machine and they do not directly rub each other. It fills up the tiny hills and valleys of the surfaces, making them smoother. So interlocking of hills and valleys is avoided to a greater extent and movement becomes smoother. So when we play carom board, we see that powder is sprinkled on the carom board to reduce friction. So what do? We use talcum powder to reduce friction. Since the powder reduces friction, a coin travels much faster on a powdered carom board than on an unpowdered carom board. Next is by polishing. So when the surfaces are highly polished, so the irregularities of the surfaces are covered, making them smoother, and friction is reduced. And by using ball bearing. So what is ball bearing and how it works? So ball bearing is a hollow circular device it is a device which contains small metal balls which are fitted around the moving parts of a machine. They are fitted in moving parts of the machine. The ball bearing reduces the friction as it converts sliding friction into a rolling friction. Rolling frictions. Another is by using rollers and wheels. So you have seen suitcases with wheels. So many heavy objects are provided with small wheels to reduce friction, and it is very easy to carry them. Another is by streamlining. So already we have discussed what is streamlined shape. So streamlined helps to reduce air friction. In the same way, bodies of boats and ships are streamlined to reduce the friction of water.